let's assume everyone can see that. And we'll grab that quickly, put that over there. Great. So yeah, as Leon introduced, hi everyone, my name is Adam. I run a studio called BetaJester. We're based up in Yorkshire, so sort of Hull and York and that kind of space. So I personally sort of run the technology side. So I'm all about making games. I'm all about building up the systems, the AI, the mechanics, all that kind of space. And today what I want to talk about is about improving your game. So specifically, I want to talk about the polish mindset. So you might have heard from people, you know, if you're ever showing people your games, what they look like, people saying, oh, it's not polished enough, or, oh, it's not, it doesn't grab me, or it's good, but I think, you know, you could do more with it, or the thing, sort of vague things like this. What they're really talking about here is having a polished game. So what I wanted to do to talk to you today about what it means to have a polished game, how you can go about it, references that you can use to sort of see the difference between a polished and unpolished game, and going from there. So because I talk about a few key areas. Firstly, I'm going to talk about definitions, just defining what polish means. I'm going to talk about some key aspects. I'm going to break down some areas of polish that when you are getting sort of what you think is the end or a good point in your game, you're in a position to sort of continue working on it, and where you want to be looking at that of each aspect. So places in your, examples of games out there that do these kind of things. And then I'm going to summarize the whole thing, and should be quick time for Q&A at the end. So let's get into it. So what is polish? Polish, we've got a few definitions. I went looking, GI-Biz and Game Kama Sutra. We've got polished is a polished game is one that lacks the issues that pull the player out of the experience. That makes sense. Somebody being plugged into your game, wanting to keep playing it. You've all played games where the hours disappear into the distance. Those kind of games are polished games because they keep you in that experience. Consistency of experience, a game that feels the same. It feels well made. It feels like something from start to finish, like it was, there was clearly a team behind it. People put it together well. Nothing about it is making you go, oh, there's something wrong here. Touches or improvements to ensure your game is as aesthetically pleasing and as error-free as possible. These are all other ones as well. These are the kind of things that you should consider when you're looking at a game and it's got, where there could be errors, or it's especially notable in games that haven't been polished, things where there are bugs or problems or things break, or, it lags or something like that. These are all things that demonstrate an unpolished game. So really here we're talking about three key things: immersive, consistent, error-free. Now, the important one for me out of those one particularly is consistent, because it doesn't mean it has to be, hyper-realistic or look absolutely stunning. It has to be consistent. Some of the best games that we've ever played are not the most hyper realistic games, but they are consistent. Take something like Minecraft or Superheart or Thomas Was Alone. These are all games that have consistency to them without looking like the most stunning thing that's ever been made ever. So let's jump into sort of the areas that you can be looking into to improve the polish in your game. If you think about polish, most people would think about something like wood, for example, right? When wood is unpolished, it has a kind of a grainy feel to it. There might be marks. It might not look as clean as it could do. This is a good way to sort of set you off. And this is exactly what is exactly true for games. So here's an example of a game that I've worked on in the past, which is a game I've worked on in my studio called Basho. On the left, you see an early version. It's very static. There's not much detail to it. The characters look a bit strange. The lighting is quite limited. And then on the bottom right, yes, it's a video, but then there's a more active version. The characters have got a feel. They're moving. There's a lot more light to it. There's more detail in the UI. It's got more of a sports feel to it. These are the sort of things we're starting to talk about. The fact that you build layers and layers and layers on top of your game to turn it into something that has a bit of life to it amongst anything else. So let's start digging into the kind of areas that we're talking about. I'm going to talk about colors. I'm going to talk about depth. I'm going to talk about aesthetics, sound, music, lighting, and movement. This is not an exhaustive list. There are lots of other areas that you could be polishing, but this is a good place. These are all good places to start. And in each one, I'm going to give you an example of a game that does that particular area really well, and talk about why it does it well and why it's important. So let's get started. Colors. I imagine some of you may have seen this game. Colors are a huge part of any kind of game, right? So things like, are they making it eye-catching, making it striking? If your colors are all very flat, if you're not really using color much, if you haven't got a contrast or a palette that you're sort of building your game on, the problem is that players can easily sort of bounce off your game. They see it and it doesn't look unique. It doesn't look special. Think back on games that have color particularly in them. The game, so obviously we've got Fall Guys here. Superheart, the reds and the blacks and the whites, really striking imagery. Journey and its use of color to change the feel of the story as you're playing through. Every game you think of, Doom Eternal, both of them have really striking colors, and they use these colors to bring players into the world, make them feel a part of it. You have the ability to bring more color into your game and use it to bring players in. So if you're getting to that point where you're finishing a game and you're like, well, what do I do next? Have a look at where you can bring more color into it. Where can you make contrast between different areas? Speaking of contrast, depth. Now, a lot of games, this is true in 2D and 3D. I'm just using an example here of Parallax. Depth is really important because it suggests to a player that there is a greater world beyond that which they're playing. If you think about a game like Breath of the Wild or Skyrim, there are points when you're standing on mountains where you can see into the infinite distance. Now, if you've played those games, you can't walk infinitely. You eventually hit a brick wall. But the fact that it looks like you can, the fact that you could travel infinitely if you felt like it, the fact that it gives you that impression makes players feel like the world is real, like there's things to it that they can just explore forever. Depth is important in all spaces, not just visual. It's also important in narrative, suggesting a greater world. You may have heard lots of words like lore, things that suggest that there's more going on in this space than just the which you're seeing. Depth is really important to think into. How can you bring depth into your game? Can you add little parts to it that make it suggest there's something else going on, or scratchings on a wall that make it suggest that someone was there before, get the player thinking about who was it that was there before and why they were there. All these areas of depth are super key and help people feel like the game has a lot more reality to it. So, aesthetics. Very similar to color and depth, but building on that into something that is consistent. The aesthetics of your game are massively important. It's about matching all the different elements of your game together. So here we've got Enter the Gungeon. Now, Enter the Gungeon is not designed to be, it's not 3D. It's not got this, stunning amount of hyper realism to it. But what it is consistent. And the game is a lot of fun because everything within it has a consistent feel to it. It doesn't switch randomly between 2D characters and then a 3D sky or a building that comes out of nowhere that's in isometric view. It's all consistent. All the pixels are consistent. The feel, the maps, the levels, everything in that game is consistent. And especially when a game like that, which is procedurally generated, comes out, because it's so consistent, you always feel like you're playing something that's part of that world. And an important thing to note here, and this links into the previous talk, simple consistency is much more important than having a big, massive world that is very inconsistent. It's better to have something small and focused and polished than it is to have something large and sprawling that's full of bugs or errors or inconsistencies or old and new art or things that you weren't able to bring together. So, next area, sound. Hopefully, when you see this game, you immediately have some sounds popping into your head of swinging tennis rackets and scores going up and upset me characters. SFX are massively important for bringing, again, depth and also this level of polish into your game. They bring it to life, the cooking of a pot, the opening of a door, the sound of rain. All these things can bring the player into that world and make it feel real. These are the kind of things, when you think on games, you may not always think of the SFX. Certainly some will catch you more than others, like Mario's jump sound or picking up coins in Sonic. But it's those sounds that you don't necessarily always remember that you've heard that help to fill out the world and make it feel more real. Alongside sound is music. The soundscape of your world, how the music can sweep in and set the mood, is massively important. If any of you have played Journey, you'll know that this is a key factor, but it's also true in many other games. Think of the stings in Minecraft, or think of the soundtracks in games like Beat Saber and Thumper. These are the kind of things that bring the player fully in. If you can add a soundtrack to your game, just in a consistent piece, it sort of keeps the flow of things moving. Players sort of lock into that world space and feel that they understand the space that they're in and understand how it's meant to feel being in that world at that moment in time. So moving on, lighting. Now, obviously here on the right, we've got Spider-Man Miles Morales, a game with a huge amount of lighting. You've got energy bolts coming off the player. You've got street lamps. You've got windows, some lit, some unlit. You've got cars. Lighting is massively important because our world is lit end of the day. So we want our game worlds to be lit too. And different types of lighting can help bring in different things. Spotlights can draw focus to certain areas. Ambient lighting can make some areas light, but also some areas dark. And that allows you, those contrasts allow you to create different moods and feelings in players that, again, pull them into the world space, and it gives it more of a reality than if they were in a situation where there was just no lighting. So, movement. If you've played a game, you've probably played a game that's got movement in it. Our example here being Mario Odyssey. Now, again, how players move, how they jump, how they run, how they walk. These are all places where you can polish them up. Things like the animations, things like making sure that moving from one animation to another animation is smooth, it's polished. It's about things like, you take the example of Mario here, where you can run and jump and dash and then throw your hat and then dash onto your hat and bounce off it again, how they all sync up with each other. It's about making sure there are ways that players can do all the actions that they want to do, that you're not, that you know, that when you move from a roll into a run, it's smooth. It's not like roll, stop, and up and then running again. It's a consistent feel. You can always ask yourself the question, if this was the real world and I was using and applying these laws to it, would this work? Or would I end up in a situation where something broke down? So, ooh, that's a new one. Unfortunately, the other slide is completely broken, which is a new one on me. What I was going to show there was Super Hot. So if you look at the original demo of Super Hot, it's very flat. The characters are red humanoid bodies. There's none of the same kind of detail or vertex lighting or low poly aesthetic that you get in the final game. Whereas now, obviously, when you look at that 2 years before the game was released, the physics were there, the mechanics were there, a lot of the ideas were there, but the implementation wasn't. And so people wonder why did it take 2 years to go from that demo to that? And that's because of polish, because the team sat there and they polished every facet of the game, from the physics to the visuals, to the player characters, to the models, the details, the world space, the narrative. Everything got polished to the absolute nth degree to bring you something that is just so consistent that it's become a massive success, both in, you know, as an FPS and as a VR game. That's a kind of, if you're interested in seeing how the difference between, you know, an early stage prototype can be taken to that, I recommend looking up the Super Hot original 7-day FPS game jam demo and then comparing that to what it was made. Unfortunately, I can't show you today because the slide has crashed. I will blame Google for that one. So polish is important. Very important. You have to make time for it. If your project ends and you haven't had time to go back over it and polish it and improve it, you will be 50% away from where you could have been. Set time aside for you to go back over your project when you're finished and make sure that it is polished to the point where when you show it, you know it's got that level of detail in there. It comes in many forms, and it's important to stay consistent. You have to make sure that if you've got, you know, say you made a fantastic sweeping soundscape, but then you left your art to, you know, some things that you'd found, or you had amazing movement mechanics, but actually the whole thing is gray and drab and the colors aren't really there. You have to be consistent across all the areas. Work hard to make your game consistent and fit into all the spaces. And finally, take your games to the next level. Polish can help you take those demos and prototypes that you're building into the area where, when they do appear in your portfolio, you get people going, oh, wow, that's awesome. That looks amazing. Because games that are polished are games that are fun, games that are striking, and the kind of games that you want to be making when you're getting into the games industry. Take time to focus on the polish in your games, and your games will look all the better for it. So, if you do have any questions, I'll answer them now. I think we've got some in Q&A, and Leon can let me know. I'll also leave my email address on there, so if you do have anything after the fact, you can drop me a message.
Yeah, we certainly do have some questions. One second, got that. But yeah, look, man, thank you. That was really, really cool. I've listening to that, I was like, I didn't even realize all of those little things. But when you were talking about like Skyrim and stuff like that, and looking off into the distance, I mean, I used to play Halo all of the time, and I used to try and jump out of the map on purpose, and like walk as far as you possibly can. So it's great. I also thought that when your slide crashed, I thought that was part of the presentation, because you were going to say like, I haven't followed this presentation, but no,
I wish.
Super cool. But yeah, we've got 4 questions here, and I think we've got enough time. So the first question, how do you determine which areas you spend more time polishing than others?
So as I sort of mentioned, the key thing here is consistency. So if you have an area that is you look at it and you go, you know what, this is my best area, this is the best looking thing, bring every other area up to that level. And some of those areas might just be a little bit away, but some of those areas might be a lot away. The difference between a really well-made area and an area you only put 10 minutes into is made all the more present in a presentation by the fact that you've got an area that looks so good. People will judge, if someone sees that you have the ability to do something well, and then another area looks like you phoned it in, that says a lot more about you than if, for example, everything was sort of at that lower level. So try and bring everything up to the highest standard that you have currently.
Yeah. And then I suppose there's another question ties into this a little bit, which is, how do you stop yourself getting carried away polishing one area, like going over and over it again?
That's a difficult one, and it's a very much a hard mindset you have to get into. And a good way of doing it is to write out the list of things that you consider you need to put in to be finished, and then do those and no more. And then if you say, oh, but actually I would like to add this, add it into a list that is in like a backlog, not in the list of things you're going to do, but something you'll get to, as DLC, or when your game makes a lot of money, or something in the future, and try and keep to a limited set of this is the point in when I consider it to be done. Not perfect, but done, and try and hold it to that, because it is very easy to get lost in that trap of constantly polishing and changing and tweaking. So you have to sort of define it for yourself as early as possible.
Okay, cool. And then another question here we've got: what would you prefer, a polished game with a lot of bugs, or an unpolished early access game fully awesome functionality?
It's sort of the other way around, is that a polished game doesn't really have bugs. That's the problem. A polished game is one that you've played and you've removed all the bugs from. I think if you're talking about, if I rephrase the question slightly, I would rather see a smaller version of a game. So, just showing off one mechanic or one level, or just a 5-minute window that was really well made, than something that showed me all the possibilities, but some of them didn't work, or they weren't all fully formed, or, I tried to open one door and the game crashed. I would rather see a little bit of something really well done than a lot of something that's not quite there yet.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, cool. That makes sense. There's a question here around game jams, which is why does everyone suggest game jams when they're not part of university course programs? And I know that you hosted the global game jam and stuff, so to get your insight into that.
So for me personally, game jams aren't part of a course because they are generally voluntary things. They take place over a very short space of time. Normally they take place, 48 hours over a weekend. So they can't be made to, you can't be conscripted into it. It's not something that you have to do. However, you are unlikely in any sort of professional capacity to be able to put in that much creative input in such a short space of time. 48 hours is not long. One weekend, but you can come out of that with a game, with something that you can show off. So, for example, the last global game jam just happened. I've made a game that I was really happy with, and I'm now working on it with friends of mine from that game jam, because it lets you focus on just making a game and not worrying about the business or the mechanics or the future of the game, and just making something awesome. And there's really not many other ways to do that. But you have to do it in a way that works for you. Don't just sit up for 48 hours. I can do another talk on game jams. Don't just sit for 48 hours and don't sleep. It's about making something in a way that works for you, but having the time to put that creative input in.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, cool. Now that makes sense. I mean, we run, as we run loads of them on the student membership program, and
absolutely,
watching the students create some of the stuff that comes out the back end of it. And I know that there's some really kind of successful games that have come out of the back of game jams. So yeah, really valuable. And then final question here, which is slightly different. Do you have any ideas for computer science dissertation projects that would be good for going into the games industry? Appreciate it. Quite broad, but
I think what you want to be looking at is what are the clever things that games are doing now. So there's a lot of areas which games have done a lot of the time in the past. If you make a dissertation on just an FPS, then that's great, but is that doing something new? Look at the games that are doing weird and interesting things, your procedural generation, your photogrammetry, your new types of narrative, all those kind of spaces which we've only just started to explore, and dig into them and start to look at, okay, well, what does a game look like of this type look like today? How can I use AI or machine learning or 3D assets or AR or whatever it might be to create something that works with the games of yesterday turned into the games of tomorrow? That'd be the space that I'd be looking in.
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, look, Adam, honestly, man, thank you so much for taking part. Really appreciate everyone in the chat saying how great it was. The other thing as well is if you could drop your email address or whatever way that people could contact you into the chat, because a few of them have asked for that as well.
Yeah. Now.
Thank you very much for taking part. Appreciate it.
No worries. Thank